In this video, I want to introduce you to one of Orwell's masterpieces. That is his short allegorical novella, Animal Farm. And if you've read it, you'll know why I drew these little pictures here of a flag and a windmill and a little house. And if you haven't read it, you'll figure out what these things mean in due course. Animal Farm is a very short little novel. Again, it's often called a novella. Comes out in about 1945, and it fits into the general context quite nicely of Orwell's work. If you want to know a little bit more about his context, you have to go back to the videos that I've done previously. So check those out and refresh your memory about Orwell and who he was. I just want to jump basically into an overview of it before I get actually into the text itself. So, as I said, it's called an allegorical novella. Novella is an Italian word, just meaning new, and allegorical comes from the old Greek term allegoria, which means like a figurative, a veiled language, figurative language. So we've got a special kind of way of communicating here in a kind of veiled way. One way you can think of it is that you're going to get a certain story in one way, and then the meaning's coming out in a different way. We'll see more of how that works. So let's start first, though, with the notion of an allegory. Okay, an allegory is not an analogy. You've heard the word analogy, where two things resemble each other. That's not what an allegory is. An allegory is a kind of literary device. Basically, it's a narrative, a story-like structure that uses symbolic figures and actions, and it has, in a sense, two levels that you can think of it. You have a literal story, and you have a figurative story. So there are literal meanings, like literally what you are actually reading about. In Orwell, the literal story is what's going on the farm, like the actual story about the animals and what they do. That's the literal level of it. So but that's not the whole story, so to speak. Or you can think of it as that's one part, and the other part is, what does this mean in a different wavelength here? What are we supposed to take it? What's the real meaning behind it? So there's two stories in a sense going on here. Now, Orwell is certainly not the first to write like this. This is a long tradition in literature. It might be new in the sense of it's a book length, right? A novella is kind of like a short novel, usually, maybe about 100 pages, larger than a short story, but definitely longer than the novel. So it was a new way of writing, but the allegory itself is ancient. And let's think about this. There's a couple of famous allegories, and perhaps the most famous one in philosophy is found in Plato's Republic, Stephanus numbers 514a to 528, and that is the allegory of the cave. And briefly, the allegory of the cave is, and if you read through that, what you've got is a very simple little story. It can be a little bit absurd when you look at it, but there's a deep meaning to it. And essentially, a group of people are yes, they're in a cave. They're all facing the same direction. They're watching shadows on the wall. But they don't think they're watching shadows. They think they're watching kind of like a movie, right? So that's the way to think of this, kind of like a movie theater. They're watching all these shadows on the wall. Behind them are puppets, and behind those puppets is a bright fire. So the fire is throwing the light, the shadows cast by the puppets, and people are all facing that same direction. They don't know they're in a cave. They think the shadows on the wall are reality. And then one day, somebody, Plato doesn't really tell us why, or his narrator Socrates doesn't really tell us why, just stands up and turns around and notices what's going on. And then eventually goes over to the puppets, sees that the puppets are, and the fire's causing the shadows, looking at the people, still watching, and then notices a little light, and then eventually leaves the cave and goes out into the bright sunshine and realizes there's a whole other world out there. And then makes the decision, although as happy as he or she, Plato doesn't really say, just sort of a philosophical figure, realizes that there is a duty to go back into the cave and tell people the truth. Now, if you read that literally, you'd say, why did Plato put a little story like this in there? What is that? Well, of course, it's not that. That's the literal story of Plato's. I just told you the literal story of the allegory of the cave. What's the figurative story? What's the allegory really about? What's the other level of meaning? Well, the cave is an allegorical symbol of the body, right? And the watching the shadows on the wall is an allegorical symbol of basically the senses. And getting up, turning, and leaving is a way of escaping is symbolic of escaping the body and getting out of the cave and seeing the sun in the sky, right? That's an allegorical symbol of true reality. And then going back in the cave is the philosopher who has seen the true reality, going back into regular society and understanding that regular society is trapped in their bodily senses and whatnot. And the philosopher has to lead others out of the cave, out of the confines of the senses, and such that they can appreciate true reality. So you have, again, two stories going on. One is the literal story, being in the cave, and the other is the figurative one of the real meaning that lies behind it. Dante's Inferno, the Divine Comedy, first part, Dante down into hell with Virgil, and his travels through hell and all the crazy stuff he sees down there. That is the literal story. And but what's the meaning of all this? What's all this about? Well, if you're familiar with this story, Dante, yeah, he descends into hell, goes all the way through, comes up on the other side, basically of the earth, and eventually makes his way through purgatory and up into heaven. Well, this is a literal story, yeah, guy going through all these places in the medieval universe, the medieval cosmos, but ultimately it's a story of the soul's journey back to God, where Dante represents kind of the every person. And as long as you have Virgil to lead you through, but Virgil can only take you so far, eventually it's a return to God. So that's the figurative dimension. There's a literal and a figurative dimension. Now, I don't want to get too much into all the literary criticism of all this, but so the notion of allegory is ancient. We have little mini allegories as well, like super mini ones, even shorter than these kinds of things. This is short. This is fairly long work. We sometimes have little allegories to illustrate basic ideas, like Newton sitting under the apple tree and getting hit with an apple and then thinking about it and coming up with a theory of gravity. That's a little story to illustrate the process of scientific discovery. It's a little closer to reality than certainly these other things, because Newton was a real person and he's a character in the story. But the same thing, the apple is symbolic of the sudden flash of insight and the thinking his way through into a new scientific revolution. Animal Farm is again in this tradition, but animals as characters, which is what this one's all about. The animals are the characters, right? Humans are not really at all in this story, very, very little, but there's not too much of it. It's mainly about animals, and animals as characters. Sometimes these are called fables, and this is a kind of allegorical structure. And this too is ancient, because we've got the ancient Greek writer Aesop. Did Aesop really exist? There's some debate about it, but in any case, there's certainly a collection of little stories of Aesop, and many of those we heard when we were kids. Maybe you've heard some of them, maybe not. But in any case, when I was younger, I did hear a lot of Aesop's fables and read little kids' books on them. But they were a pedagogical tool, a profound pedagogical tool for teaching morals. So a lot of allegories, the goal is to express a moral. Even in Plato's Republic, one of the morals that's expressed is that knowledge generates obligations. The philosopher goes out, learns truth, and is happy and delights in the truth outside of the cave, but resigns Okay, I got to go back in and have everybody ridicule me about how crazy I am to think there's life outside the cave. Just keep watching those shadows. That's reality. So, knowledge engenders a moral obligation is sort of the moral of the story of the Republic. And of course, this is all about sin, right? The soul is eventually going through the depths of sin and getting out of it. So there's a moral to that story. Aesop, one I want to point out, one of his fables that's quite interesting is the bulls and the butchers. And in that story of Aesop's, basically is is the one about a bunch of bulls are sitting around and they're tired of being butchered. They're thinking of a revolution. So they're like this is Aesop's version of Animal Farm, and the bulls are sitting around. They start talking. They're like, okay, why don't we let's get together. Let's collectivize. We're going to get together. We're going to overthrow the butchers. And when they're kind of getting ready to do this, and you'll see Orwell borrows this structure. A wise old bull says, wait a minute, wait a minute. You should be thinking a little bit more carefully about this. And it's a grisly sort of thing he says, but makes all the bulls think. He says, well, the butchers, yes, they are killing us, and so that men can have meat. But on the other hand, the butchers know what they're doing. And so when they kill us quickly, they kill us in the most humane way that can be done. So while we are forced to our deaths by the butchers, it's fast. If you overthrow these professionals, what you're going to get is a group of amateur butchers. And what's worse, being killed by a professional butcher or an animal butcher? So careful what you overthrow, what structure you overthrow, because you could get amateurs in. And at the end of the day, says the old bull to the revolutionary bulls, men will still want us for our meat. And yeah, rather chilling and tale. But so this idea of writing about animals is nothing new with Orwell. It's nothing new in literature. So Orwell is in a tradition of this kind of writing. And of course, science fiction resembles this in some ways. It's another offshoot in a different direction because a lot of science fiction has an allegorical feel to it in the sense that it might have a certain story. It might be about rockets or whatever, but it could be more or less, as much of it is a social critique. So in that sense, when you're reading Animal Farm, yeah, you're reading a story that does involve animals. You're reading about pigs and dogs and cows and stuff like that. But that's the literal story. There's a figurative meaning as well. So lots of literature has, shall we say, two very clear layers, and it's up to you as a reader to engage with it and try and figure out what the actual elements, the symbols and the figures and the actions, what are they symbolizing? So where do you take this, and that will give you access to the other side of the story, namely the figurative story. Now, Orwell, as when he named the book, it's named Animal Farm, but it's actually Animal Farm, a fairy story. So he doesn't call it an allegory. And in England, in the early 20th century, fairy stories were quite important. The author J.R.R. Tolkien, a Lord of the Rings guy, he's got a number of works scholarly works on fairy tales. So these were important teaching devices too, and they were often stories that were populated by fantastic characters, and they were some kind of pedagogical moral devices for teaching morals as well. Now, that's just scratching the surface on all this stuff. If you're interested in how literature is organized, a classic book to start with is, and it's quite old now, but I still think it has a lot of merit. It's, as I said, it's a classic, is Northrop Frye's Anatomy of Criticism for essays. There's he delves into a lot of this stuff in detail and tries to put some kind of order on literature and on all the different forms that it can take. Okay, so there's your overview, and I've got a couple more things, and see you in the next video.